Perfect. Awesome. So hey everyone, up next we have Austen. He's been a custodian user for a while. He loves bicycling, but not only the physical one, but the virtual one too. So I don't know if you play any virtual games, anybody. He'll definitely share a link to that, and you can compete with him. You can probably see the bicycle in the back as well. But he'll be talking about how they're using Cloud Custodian as premise data. I believe you have used Custodian at a previous role too. I'll let you introduce yourself and then take it from there.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be here talking at the first ever Governance as Code Day. This is a very interesting and important area of work, and it's great to see the community growing. I've been involved in this space for a few years now, working at Capital One on the Cloud Custodian team there, both on the open source project as well as Capital One's Cloud Custodian platform. I then joined Premise Data earlier this year on the infrastructure and security team, and ended up relying on Cloud Custodian quite a bit. So this talk will focus on the initial problems I faced at Premise Data, specifically focusing on the sensitive infrastructure such as firewalls, service accounts, keys, and buckets. I'll talk through my journey in tackling these resources and ultimately how I was able to solve for the underlying difficulties in remediating these resources, which include Cloud Custodian Metric Filters and a new execution mode I contributed this year based on Security Command Center. This talk will focus mostly on GCP, but the lessons and strategies are cloud agnostic. So as you all already know, it is extremely important to immediately and on an ongoing basis remediate issues to core infrastructure resources, especially resources such as firewalls, service accounts, and VMs. However, when I joined Premise Data, there was a lot of issues and problems with these resources, which should have been tackled a while ago. These issues ranged from overprivileged service accounts, maybe some overly open firewall rules, to VMs that were years old. And this is not uncommon for a startup whose initial priorities are to move fast and address potential issues later. Well, that time has come for us now to start cleaning up some of the legacy resources. And I was curious to understand why these vulnerabilities had not been and were not being addressed. My first hypothesis was that maybe the teams, many of them who are new to the cloud, may not have the ability or time to understand or find vulnerabilities in these resources. So I thought if I could help teams discover vulnerabilities and problems, then they would go ahead and remediate them. To tackle the hypothesis problem, I took two avenues. The first, leveraging existing tools such as Security Command Center, which is similar to AWS's Security Hub. The second approach involved creating custom Cloud Custodian policies to find common misconfigurations and other problems. For Security Command Center, the default setup actually is quite good at finding issues. So by simply turning it on, it was immediately able to find many issues ranging from low, medium, high severity. However, just turning on this service is not quite enough since we have many developers across many different projects. So it became difficult to figure out who owns what resources. It is also very hard to prioritize these findings as they range from having logging disabled to firewall ports being open. So another issue is that a lot of the default settings in Google are actually triggering findings themselves. So in many cases, it wasn't even the user who created the non-compliant resource, but Google itself. So in order to make Security Command Center findings actionable, we decided to focus initially on high severity findings on the sensitive cloud infrastructure, such as the firewall rules, service accounts, service account keys. We immediately ran into one problem, which is figuring out who owns these resources. Since these resources are not tagged by default with who created them, and even if they were, many of those resources are years old and the original developers are long gone. Since we have no insight into who owns the individual resources, we decided to group the findings at the project level and assign teams to address those findings in those projects. So we now had a list of non-compliant resources and teams assigned to remediate them. In parallel, we also developed a few Cloud Custodian policies to find further misconfigurations. So with this additional list of resources, we again run into the ownership problem. So I had to assign these resources to teams at the project level as well. I mean, I felt pretty great. In only a few days of work, we found plenty of issues, notified the corresponding teams, and tasked them with remediating them. Now all I have to do is monitor progress and lend help when teams had any questions. However, no progress was made and very little is being remediated. This was disheartening, but taught me that discovering vulnerabilities is easy and not the bottleneck in fixing non-compliant issues. So I need to come up with another hypothesis. My next idea was that engineering teams were not remediating these vulnerabilities because they didn't know how to or had no automated ways to do so. Maybe it's just too time consuming, so they're putting it off and deprioritizing. I believe this is a valid concern, since engineers who are not very comfortable with the cloud may not know even where to start to remediate a resource. While this concern can be improved with proper training and reading through some documentation and playing around the console, there's still the question of how to remediate a risk. For example, if we have an overprivileged service account, there are quite a few avenues that the engineer can take. The easiest would be to simply delete it and problem solve. However, that obviously would cause other problems for those relying on that service account. They also have options to disable the service account, or most obviously remove privileges. However, simply removing permissions is not quite as straightforward as you may think. The engineer would need to know why this service account was overprivileged in the first place, on the context on why it's being flagged now, and then maybe what would happen if those privileges were removed. Maybe instead of simply removing privileges, they should replace it with a lesser role. So they need to understand the different roles available, or maybe even create new custom roles. So as you can see, there are many different dimensions that an engineer would need to understand in order to safely and confidently remediate a non-compliant resource, and could be the source of why resources were not being remediated as quickly as I hoped. The other thought is that maybe developers didn't have the right tools to remediate the resources. For example, maybe the only way to make changes is to click manually in the console or run a series of CLI commands to remediate the resource. While this works on one resource, it may not work on hundreds. And also, there's always a risk when you click on the wrong button, so we prefer an automated solution. So to test my hypothesis that the problem lies with the action of remediating resources, I looked into what software was available to help the developer understand how to remediate a resource finding. In addition, I planned on building tooling that would automate the more remedial and time-consuming findings. First, I tackled the knowledge problem and looked at what resources are available to help provide information to engineers on how to remediate a security finding. In this case, Security Command Center is an excellent place to start, and they actually have built-in description and remediation steps for most findings. In the example on the slide, we see for a low severity finding, a flow logs disabled. We see that the description mentions why logging is helpful and the remediation steps. These steps are quite thorough and even provide links for the developer to get started. This is exactly what we're looking for in terms of providing concrete steps to engineers. Next, I wanted to solve for the use case that there are simply too many findings to manually remediate, so I wanted to build some automated solutions that help. Here, Cloud Custodian was extremely helpful since most of the actions we would want to automate are already built in. And combined with filters, we could create very simple and powerful policies to execute exactly what we want to remediate. For example, service accounts in GCP have actions that allow us to disable and delete them, as well as actions to delete their keys if desired. I then shared these custodian policies, posted links to Security Command Center, to the corresponding teams, and waited and waited. Again, there's very little actions taken, even with the steps listed explicitly and the actions automated. I was surprised by this and decided to dig one step deeper. I felt that I was close, but I was just missing one key piece of information. This led me to my next and final hypothesis, which was that even though users knew what they were supposed to do and have the automated tools at their disposal, they are unsure of the impact of those actions on the corresponding systems, or error on the side of not doing anything. Better to have a few security findings than to actively make a change that negatively affects customers and the business. So we wanted to understand at a deeper level if it was true that engineers were simply reluctant to remediate security issues because they did not know the impacts of these actions. It makes perfect sense, especially in the case of sensitive cloud infrastructure, where in many cases there is no undue action, especially for deleting resources. And these resources have the potential to have enormous impacts. A wrong firewall rule can prevent any traffic from flowing and cause every application and service to go down. Also, with these services, there's no way to test what would happen as in an A/B test, or even testing in different environments, because in many cases they can be unique. There's no A/B test for a service account key or firewall rule in a similar way as there is a new application version. In many cases, the offending resources are legacy components from previous engineers, so there's no one to ask what this resource is used for, and often no documentation. Now, we were pretty certain that this was what was holding us back. The key then is to empower individuals to start cleaning up these highly sensitive and risky resources, is to provide answers to a variety of questions as, is this resource still even being used? If it is being used, then by how much and what components are using it? By providing answers to these questions, we get a lot of insights into the potential impacts. For the cases that the resources are not even being used, it becomes very easy to remediate, and we can leverage the automated custodian scripts mentioned earlier. Now that we have a better understanding of the problem, we wanted to get an automated way to get the information we wanted. To do that, we want to use GCP's metric filters. So yeah, what are GCP metric filters and why are they so powerful? So similar to AWS's CloudWatch, but yet GCP has a metric collection service called Cloud Monitoring. Cloud Monitoring collects measurements to help you understand how your applications and systems are performing. And at the most basic level, a collection of these measurements is generically called a metric. What is powerful about GCP's metrics is that there are more than 1,500 types of pre-built metrics available in monitoring. And if you need something that isn't already defined, you can create your own. And the great thing about these built-in metrics is that they have quite a few that measure usage. This allows us to determine if resources are being used at all, and if so, by how much. GCP has compiled a giant list that you can browse that is sorted by service, or you can play around in the metric console, which we have shown in this slide here. And while these metrics in themselves are helpful, you don't want to be checking these metrics manually for all of your resources, especially in large cloud environments that span multiple projects. And there's still a remediation piece that you'd like to automate as part of this process as well. To solve for both of these problems, I contributed a custodian metric filter that allows you to use these metric filters in a Cloud Custodian policy, which allows you to utilize Cloud Custodian's built-in actions and filters in combination with these GCP metrics. So here I wanted to go over the custodian metric fields briefly, since I wanted to highlight that even though these may look quite simple, there's a few things going on behind the scenes and they end up being quite powerful. The first policy on the left is for deleting unused service account keys in your environment. It begins with a regular value filter to ignore any system managed keys that we don't want to touch. Then we use the new metric filter. Here, the key parameter is the metric name, which in this case is the auth event count metric that is on service account keys. Behind the scenes, the filter will generate the correct query to GCP to get the metrics for every service account key that was not filtered up to this point. And this solves a lot of time because these queries can get quite complex and really verbose. So having that kind of automated behind the scenes will save a lot of time. You can then pass in additional fields such as the days you want to query the aggregate over. In this case, we use 90 days, and the aligner. The aligner can be tricky because some metrics you may want to sum, others you may want to average. In this case, we want the sum of all authorization events and want any missing values, which denote the service account as not being used, to be -1. Then we can use the operation parameter, much as in a value filter, to filter out all service account keys that have been used, which in this case corresponds to any authorization events in the last 90 days. So now we have filtered out any service account keys used in the last 90 days and can pass the remaining unused keys to the action block in this policy. In this case, we want to clean up our environment and delete them. Another great option before executing this policy is to run this policy in dry run so we can verify which keys are being potentially deleted and further evaluate the risks before running this policy. The policy on the right is quite similar. In this case, we're looking at unused firewall rules in the last 90 days and then using the disable action. The only change required is the metric name, which mentioned earlier, GCP has compiled into a nice list that is easy to search for. And while this is probably not the best policy on its own, you can also include additional filters that check for firewall rules that, say, have an allow statement or look for specific ports. Another benefit of utilizing metric filters is combine these filters with Custodian's built-in C7N org tool, as well as its reporting functionality. For those of you who are not familiar, C7N org allows you to run your policy against any number of projects and accounts that you would like. This allows you to quickly get information across your organization in a single go. The output of running a policy using C7N org is separated out into different folders for each project and would require some manual work to investigate and aggregate a list across all projects. But C7N org luckily has a built-in option called report, which automates this aggregation. So running this report command with the output directory from your previous command, it will aggregate all of your resources into a single CSV file, which you can then share or dive into, We now have an end-to-end solution to discover vulnerabilities using Custodian and Security Command Center. We can then investigate the impact and usage of these flagged resources using Custodian metric filters. We can output the results of these metric filters in the CSV file, look into the resources in more detail, and once we are confident in the metrics, simply automate the entire process using these metric filters together with Cloud Custodian actions. Now, before I end my talk, I want to highlight another avenue to remediate sensitive infrastructure while mitigating potential impacts, and that is to delete vulnerable resources as they are being created. The thought process here is that the impact would be minimal since these resources would be net new and would be deleted before they even had a chance to be used and become a dependency elsewhere. This is the ideal state, since you wouldn't have to worry about cleaning up your cloud in the future if it was never able to get into a vulnerable or dirty state to begin with. Well, ideally, that sounds great. In practice, it's a little more difficult as clouds continuously update their offerings and settings, which means that resources that are originally compliant may become non-compliant in the future. Also, you may not want to terminate everything that is net new and non-compliant, since there may still be some business impacts, or there's some infinite loops if a deployment script is running and requires certain infrastructure to be up. However you would like to actually execute, the key piece would be to utilize Custodian's new execution mode called GCP SEC. This mode triggers your custodian policy when a security command center finding is found that matches your resource type. You can then filter on that finding to limit when actions would be taken. For example, the policy showed here is triggered on any new findings on firewall rules. It then has a filter to run only actions that have a high severity finding. In this case, the action is to delete. This is because SEC can have a lot of low severity findings that deal with logging and tagging, so you probably don't want to delete new firewalls simply on those. You can also trigger tagging events or notification events as soon as these SEC findings are created as well, if you want teams to be immediately notified and look into them manually. Overall, utilizing both the real-time remediation strategy mentioned here and the previously discussed solutions leveraging metric filters in cloud custodian policies are great first steps in cleaning up and maintaining a secure environment while minimizing the potential impacts on your sensitive resources. So in conclusion, we went over the different steps to understand why it is difficult to remediate sensitive cloud infrastructure. We learned it is often not because we can't find any vulnerabilities. We also learned that it is not because it is unclear on how to fix the issues or because it is difficult to automate the remediation steps. Instead, we discovered that the main issue with sensitive cloud infrastructure is understanding what the potential impacts are, since in most cases, the potential downtime of your entire cloud always outweighs the potential risks that these vulnerable resources in themselves cause. In order to understand the potential impacts, we learned to leverage metric filters, which can be included directly into custodian policies to easily generate reports or fully automate the remediation process using Cloud Custodian entirely. And finally, we learned that we can remediate resources in real time using Cloud Custodian's Security Command Center execution mode to further reduce risks of remediating sensitive resources later on. So yeah, thank you all for your time. I'll open it up for questions or comments. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Austen. So while we'll give everyone a minute and I can scroll through the Q&As for any questions, what do you think about Custodian Day so far?
Oh, I love it. I'm so glad we finally had this. I know it's been mostly like a disk or was it Gitter and GitHub, so it's nice to kind of see a lot of faces in person and just see the community from all around the world in one place. It's been fun. Hopefully we can do something in person at some point, but still nice to see people and listen to all the talks.
Yeah, absolutely. So a quick question for you. Have you hit any tricky edge cases with Google metric filters, like false positives, where used resources appeared unused? If so, how did you handle those with Custodian?
We did have actually one edge case. So that's why it's always good to have the dry run and kind of get the initial list. We had one with bucket. I think it was like bucket policies. We were switching from uniform bucket access switching to uniform bucket access from ACLs. So we were using the authorization event there, but there was actually, I guess, a couple different types of authorizations, including like, I forget what it's called, but like through third parties, through I think like API keys directly. So there was actually one or two events that were not actually included in that actual metric. It affected only like one bucket, but yeah, you have to make sure you understand what is actually being included in those metric events. But for like the 95% of other cases, we actually had no problems at all, especially with service account keys, service accounts in general. Those metrics proved to be very useful, and we were able to actually remove a lot of unused resources that way without like any risks.
Great. I think Michael is giving you a thumbs up on your presentation. And there's a message for you there that there's a lot of thought seems to be gone behind cleaning up your cloud accounts, right? So thumbs up on that. I think everyone has been talking about your presentation. I see the chat there. We might have time for one more question if you want to put it in the chat window or in the Q&A. Let me double check. In the Q&A too, a lot of times the questions come in a bit later. So if someone has a question, you can go in the Q&A and actually reply to it as well. But because there's a bit of a delay. So let me just give one more.
Yeah, and if people have any questions or about the custodian, the TOG, they can always reach out to me as well. I'm always happy to chat custodian or cloud or general or anything else. So
yeah, so you'll be on the platform for a bit more?
Yep.
Okay, so you can find him, you can message him. I definitely tried direct messaging, it works. I've seen there are a lot of people who seem to be doing it in the networking side too, so I looked at that feature. But yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you so much. You're right on time. So
Perfect.
if
Thanks
there are
so
more
much for
questions,
having
I'll
me.
see you. Yeah.